Welcome to the Dick and Russ podcast. We're your hosts, Andre and Sammy. No video today, doing it podcast style. And we're going to talk to you guys about meaning, purpose, and expectation of oneself. Sammy?
Yes, sir. So there's like a million different routes you can go with this, but I think the first thing that comes to mind is like I don't I don't think it's a good thing to like narrow it to one thing. I think that's probably the most important thing.
For purpose, right?
Yeah, for purpose and meaning. Cause like I feel like a lot of religions have this trait where uh, especially people who are really motivated by the afterlife, where like meaning and purpose is like necessarily tied to like one thing. It's like tied to if if I'm not working closer towards this goal of like being with God forever, and like helping other people get there, then whatever I'm doing is like not worthwhile. I think that's a minority. I think most people generally have, even if they hold that, most people have the like more wide ranging sense of like meaning and purpose, where it's like, no, I get meaning out of almost everything I do, that I find worthwhile. Like any hobby I have, any relationship I have, you know, my work, I'm gonna find meaning in all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so it's funny how everything kind of comes back to this like religious difference between like secularism and religious um, people, because you usually get like that second answer that I provided from like secular people mainly, and they're like, oh yeah, I get meaning just everything, right? Whereas like more religious people are like, usually they say that as well, but they're mainly like, no, I have this one bigger thing that is kind of guiding my life.
As far as that goes, I think the one thing I want to talk about is how what I do notice is when you kind of find meaning in everything, the things that you do, and you're going to think I'm weird for this, but they almost don't have as much meaning as well. So, versus, when something brings you to what, you think is a higher purpose, usually you have a lot of passion and emotion towards that. And at least, like for me, and where I was at before, where I am now, right? When I used to, like for instance, soccer, like my identity was basically soccer.
Same.
But it was to a point where I had this passion, this fire, this fuel that I don't feel anymore in the same capacity that I once did. So I think that's the one struggle, at least for me, with meaning, where I think you can't find meaning in everything. But I think there's certain things that we're just more attached to that almost feel like purpose.
Yeah, it's funny. I think this is a Buddhist term, dharma. Don't quote me on that, but from what I've read, it's kind of like not like fate or like what you're supposed to do. It's just like what like your innermost being feels like it's here to do. And yeah, like in I think it's Buddhism, they call that your dharma. And there's like a little story that I think is like pretty funny, where there's like, I think it's like a monk who's sitting by a river, and he sees this scorpion fall into the river, and he pulls it out and he gets stung by the scorpion. And this happens over and over and over again. The scorpion keeps falling in and it's going to die. So the monk keeps pulling it back out, keeps getting stung. And someone comes up to the monk and they're like, I mean, what are you doing? You're getting stung every time you're pulling this scorpion out of the river. Is it really worthwhile? And the monk's response is, well, it's the scorpion's dharma to sting me, and it's my dharma to save the scorpion. And I that has just really stuck with me as like, it's so beautiful, especially as a vegan. That to me is just so fucking beautiful. Because it's like you're not you're not doing this just for yourself. Like
Right.
there's this inner drive that everyone has, and it's different based on who you are. But like, I think for me, it's mainly driven by like helping other people, and
Right.
like I think that's most people. Like they want to be serving some larger group, something larger than themselves, right?
Right.
And that, I think that's a big part of our meaning in life, is like we want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And you see this with people finding so much meaning in God, because God is this all encompassing, all powerful imbuer of everything. Like he's the creation of everything, creator of everything. So that's being a part of this huge narrative. But it can go all the way down to just like, you can find meaning in just some small group, some like small church group, for instance. Maybe you're not even religious, you just find so much meaning in like a family dynamic, right?
Right.
It's just something larger than yourself that you find like you can contribute to. And I think that's a really deep longing for humans, just like inherently. So I always find that interesting, that story. Really good.
Yeah. Not and going back to what you were saying about maybe even a youth group or a church group, right? At least for me, I wouldn't call myself Christian, but lately I've been looking for something like that,
Mm.
just because it's that sense of community, right? And I will say, like back when we were at Biola, and this is one thing that I think uh, Christian churches in our area at least do really well, is that sense of community.
Yeah.
And having those events and having those outreaches to everyone, right? Not just other Christians, which I mean, at least for me, I feel like I find a lot of meaning in that. Because a lot of times, even though what we talk about isn't necessarily like secular, it can be applied in a secular way. And I think
Mhm.
there's always, like you said, a lot of meaning in everything. It just depends on how we take it,
Yeah.
on how we view it, right? So, as far as expectations go, tying in with meaning and purpose, what it where should expectations lie? Are there certain things that you have like more expectations for, at least in your life? How about that?
Yeah.
Do you have more expectation of yourself like in certain things, or you just have this overall expectation that you should be this type of person, be doing these kinds of things? What does that look like?
So expectations is interesting because I think most of the time expectations are a result in dissatisfaction most of the time. Because what an expectation is you can think about it in a couple different ways, but here's like one way I think about it. It's like I'm wanting this to happen in the future, and not just wanting it, but like an expectation is like this will happen in the future more likely than not.
Mhm.
So if that doesn't come to fruition, if it doesn't happen in the future, then you've made this like you're basically living in this almost fantasy world in your head of like expectation. It obviously you can't rid yourself of expectation,
Right.
our society can't really function without expectation. It's just a part of you know having foresight. Like if I go to the store, I expect there to be food in the store. Like
Right.
if I go and drive to see my girlfriend, I expect her to be there. So like I don't think the thing that I'm trying to say here is like stop having expectations. I think the more important thing with expectations is don't let it uh, be um, the replacement for what there is, right?
Mhm.
So like whatever there is, that should be what you accept, right? Like if you drive and you go to the store and there actually is no food, and you built up this expectation so much that, oh my god, there's supposed to be food. This is a really extreme example. There's probably a lot more subtle things that we can talk about, but
Right.
let's just stay with this one. um like if you are just able to be with what there is, in a way that like you just it's basically acceptance, right? And I think acceptance is kind of a sort of at odds with expectations in a lot of ways, because if you are able to accept a lot of what you encounter in life, you know, your expectations are no longer going to cause you any suffering, right?
Right.
Like if you're able to accept whatever circumstances you're dealt with for what they are, which is not the same as saying you're going to sit idly and just be okay with them. You know, acceptance is not this idle, you know, passivity. Acceptance is like acknowledging this is the way things are, right? Rather than like this is the way I wish they were. It's
Right,
like
yeah,
I understand and I appreciate this is the way things are. What do I do with it now? Yeah.
So I would say, with that being the case, then it's actually really good to have high expectation, so long as you understand acceptance.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So the expectation isn't at all the problem.
I don't think so.
It's those who have a hard time with acceptance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because like, I mean, I'll use Chloe for example. Like, she she gets so excited about things, right? And like, it's
Yeah.
one of my favorite things about Chloe.
Yeah,
She she like loves planning things, and like it's just like her love language to like plan things and to
Yeah.
you know she gets really excited to the point that she like builds up some expectations for things.
yeah.
Um,
She literally bounces
yeah,
from
right.
excitement when
Sonic the Hedgehog,
when
man.
when she's planning.
So, yeah, for her in the past, she's been let down a couple times because things didn't turn out the way that she expected them to.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that, like, you know, so like for example, we're gonna be going to Europe in May, right after we get married, and you know, I'm not like not having expectations for what's going to happen because I'm planning the whole trip. Right? I'm
Right.
planning so many things for the trip.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it is like you said. It's not like I'm removing expectations. You know, they have to exist for us to make plans and things. But if all of those plans fall through, you know, which they 100% could, you know, like COVID is a thing, and
Right.
flights. Dude, Ukraine and Russia are at war right now, just a few, like 1,000 or so miles more east from where we're going to be, in like
Right.
Switzerland and Germany. And you know, who knows what's going to happen by the time May comes around? Putin's a fucking maniac. So like, my expectations are completely level. You know, like they're not set at a point where if everything falls through, that I'm distraught. You know, like I'm trying to set up my expectations always for, you know, embracing whatever comes. And, you know, you can say that a bunch of different ways, but I think that's the simplest way I can put it. And yeah, if you're okay with like, and if you're able to just temper your expectations to the point that you're okay with whatever reality brings, then dissatisfaction is pretty rare. I mean, like, you know,
Yeah.
it's yeah.
I think it's a double-edged sword, because I we agree on a lot of things, but I have to disagree with you on this one.
Yeah.
Only because, and I say this because of experience with the kids, like the tournament that we had this past weekend, right? I think, and you see it. That's one of the things that I love about working with kids is they have such high expectations of themselves, of their teammates, of the world around them, right? They're discovering it all. Obviously, you know, we're older, we've gone through a lot of things, so our expectation differs more than someone who hasn't really gone through life in such a heavy way. And so they all have really high expectations. And at least from what I've seen from them, what I usually tend to tell them is I don't like for them to have their expectations lower than the way that they see it. I feel like the disappointment is oftentimes what really drives us, especially when we're younger.
Yeah.
And I mean, once you're older, obviously you want more stability, right? So I would say, at least for like younger generations, that disappointment that comes with high expectation you weave the acceptance into that little by little. Because obviously, if you, and I think that's one of the things that we were talking about before with how kids are these days and why a lot of them, like, they're being exposed to the world a lot sooner. And it's almost like this just acceptance for everything that they see, acceptance for war, acceptance for, and so once you have that type of acceptance, it almost kills that motivation or drive that a lot of kids used to have. Kids used to dream about doing things, right? And kids still do. But what I'm saying is, back in the day, kids would dream about doing things that now you would say, "Oh, that's crazy talk," right? As an adult.
Yeah.
But that's what it was. It was that high expectation and saying, anything I want to do, I can achieve, and I just want to keep rolling with that, no matter what the world around me is showing.
Yeah. So I think this is really, really good point, because I think when I usually talk about this, it comes out in a way that I don't mean for it to come out. Mm-hmm. So you talked about disappointment, and I don't think that's at all at odds with high expectations, but also acceptance. I think acceptance, high expectations, and disappointment can all exist without suffering. Okay, without you, like, being this fucking ball of, like, just like, I hate existence right now because these things didn't happen, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think that part needs to exist, and this is also a topic up for debate. Does that need to exist for drive, for motivation, for like longing to be as powerful as it could be? And that's a really interesting topic, because, like, I haven't thought about that enough, but I know that high expectations are not a bad thing so long as acceptance exists. Right. And disappointment is an incredibly good thing. Like, for me, like, this is a great example. So have you seen King Richard?
I have not, no.
Okay, so King Richard is a story. It's a movie about Serena Williams and what's her sister?
Oh yeah, I think we talked about this last time.
Yeah.
Serena and
can't remember. Z starts with Z. Xena?
Oh no, Venus.
Venus, yeah.
Yeah. I always remember Planet.
Yeah, so Serena and Venus and their dad Richard, and he instilled this just unstoppable mentality into them that you will be the greatest in the world. He made it a fact in their minds. And this is really interesting, because, like, in one sense, you can see how they probably would not have become the greatest if they didn't have this radical mindset that, like, I am going to be the greatest. They just fucking embodied that in their work ethic and everything to actually get there. And I think that's true for anyone who's become the greatest at anything. You cannot get there without not just thinking you can, like, you can, right? And you will, right? And it's that almost like narrative that you create that is almost necessary. I would say it probably is necessary to be the greatest at anything. And so, like, that's where we get into the conversation of, like, is it necessary for you to feel like this suffering in order to have, like, disgust and, like, this feeling of, like, righteousness and righting a wrong if things like Russia invade Ukraine? Like, if let's say, like, our government becomes communistic, and we're like abiding by my philosophy, who's to say that we're not going to be too accepting of everything? Like, oh, this is just the way things are, right?
Yeah.
But I would like to say that I don't think this acceptance and this way of, like, allowing whatever circumstances are happening to, how do I put this? So our government becomes communistic. I don't think you have to so let me put how acceptance would look in that situation. So like
Mm-hmm.
if our government became communistic, acceptance, all it would look like is saying this is the way things are. What do we do with it? Right?
Right.
It's not like, oh, let's accept it for being communistic. Let's kind of be okay with that and not do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of like I'm seeing this for what it is. It's
Right.
almost like I look at acceptance as the opposite of denial, right? So
Mhm.
it's the opposite of delusion.
Okay.
That's the way I look at acceptance, right? So I don't think that's why I don't see it at odds with, having expectations, with having motivation and drive and all these things that just being a human are.
Mhm.
Um, does that make sense?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was looking up right now, while you were saying that that it reminded me of is, and this might be like a simpler way to put it.
Yeah.
Um, but I basically I use this for like pretty much everything nowadays, and I don't know if you know about the graph, but it's the stress recovery adaptation graph.
I don't think so.
Now, so it applies to athletes and sports. It applies to how our brain and our body react to anything that we go through.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always a stressor, then comes recovery, and then comes adaptation, right? And that's when you start to grow off of what. So, like, I guess what to put it in terms of government, what you were saying, right? With our United States becomes communist, that's the stress.
Yeah.
Now, instead of slowly going into adaptation right away,
Yeah.
you go through recovery, which is not just, sitting around saying, okay, this is fun. Like it's taking a step back, thinking about what is happening,
Yeah.
and then going into that adaptation of it's almost like instead of just reacting to what has happened,
Yeah.
take a step back, see it for what it is,
Dude.
opposite of denial, and then adaptation. Now how are we gonna move forward? Right?
I think that's so perfectly put. Because like I think the thing that I'm talking about with like expectations falling through is kind of like our reaction
Yeah.
to be distraught, to be depressed, to be like suffer.
Right.
And if you can learn to respond to the situation, that to me is exactly the way that you're putting it. Like
Yeah.
the responding phase is the same as the recovery phase,
Mm-hmm.
leading into the what was the next phase after
The
that?
adaptation phase.
Leading into the adaptation phase.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a really good analogy to talk about the exact same thing. And yeah, I don't see it at odds.
Right, and so like going back to kind of, and I'll keep using my team as an example, just because I feel like that's a good way to see it in young kids, right, as they grow up. It's using the graph, especially using the graph, especially with we had two losses this weekend in our tournament. It was what I did was tell them to not just stay stuck on the loss, but to take an hour after the loss to reflect on what they could have done better, on what their teammates could have done better.
Yeah.
But then not because oftentimes, you have high expectations, right? High expectations that they're gonna win. And then they lose. And when they lose, it shouldn't just be all right, you guys lost. Like I hope you guys feel this.
Yeah.
Feel distraught the whole day and tomorrow and the next day. Right? It should be okay, feel distraught, maybe for an hour or two after the game, thinking about what you could have done better, what your teammates could have done better. But after that comes the adaptation, which is let it go. You thought about it, you know what you have to do, let it go. Tomorrow's a new day.
Yeah.
Right? So, and that's why I say I really love this graph because it applies to so many different things. Obviously, sports, right? Because that's just the field that I'm in. But I mean, your job as well, with coaching the kids, and even adults too. This process doesn't stop.
Yeah.
With anything, with us as human beings, it's always stress, recovery, and then adaptation, and then it happens again. It's this wave. It's this wave, but as long as you keep understanding that there is going to be growth.
Yeah. Yeah, this is like getting into a topic that like I've always struggled to wrap my head around because like it's it's not like an intuitive thing. It's really really strange. So here's what I've been struggling with. Is it almost like to remove parts of humanity that are important to say that we shouldn't suffer? Like we should try and remove suffering at all odds, whenever possible. Because this is the narrative that I feel like so many like quote unquote enlightened people are trying to push,
Right.
which is like there's ways that you can live without suffering, right?
Right.
And uh, I think it might even be one of the Buddhist like main tenets, which is like suffering is a given. like like there's always going to be suffering, but I feel like the way that people who are like quote unquote enlightened will try and tell you that that's a part that doesn't need to exist. So that's a really hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, because like suffering in itself is not good, right?
Right.
But is it necessary for us to you know feel this sense of growth, this sense of you know um what was the stages again? It was like the three stages.
Yeah, it's stress, recovery, adaptation. SRA.
Yeah. So it's like almost a disrupting of that graph if you remove the suffering aspect of it.
Because it's just yeah. Without the stress, there's
Yeah.
no recovery.
Yeah, and like this is the way that people usually put it. They usually put it as like there's pain, and then there's suffering, and those two are different, right? Yeah. And they are, because like pain, you can feel a shit ton of pain, but like you don't like mentally suffer through the pain. You know, like this is something I've talked to you about, where like if you stub your toe, you know, your body is going to be in a lot of pain. Right. Your toe is going to be in a lot of pain. But like suffering is that extra step of things where like you are no longer just experiencing like bodily sensations of pain. You are now in what we call suffering, which is like mental despair. I don't know how you label suffering, but
yeah, I think that's the thing with suffering, is that it's all up to perception, right? And perspective of each individual. So, for instance, something that I may not see as suffering, someone else sees it as suffering, just because of the mental view of it. So you think of monks in this case, right? There have been monks who've set themselves on fire, and they don't see that as suffering. Now, I think being burned alive, I'd probably suffer, but it's because my mentality is I don't want to be lit on fire. I don't accept the fact that I'm being lit on fire, right? So that acceptance isn't there, and I don't think it'll ever be to that point, to be honest with you. Like, but it's a mentality, right? Like the monk understands and is accepting of it, and obviously they do it for a lot of times it's been in retaliation of war, and as a sign of peace, of saying, you know, notice that I'm being burned alive, but I'm not suffering, right? Like it's just like one of those things that they do to
revolt.
Not so well. Sometimes revolt, but it's more to just like get people to think and to focus on like bigger things than just what is going on. Right? That there's other things that are more important, and the way that we view things has a lot to do with war and suffering, right? Yeah. So, like I said, I've seen it where on YouTube, and I've seen different videos of monks who they say, "I'm not suffering," like you know, and that's just their mentality, because they've got into an acceptance of life, of death, of a lot of different things, right? So I really do think it's up to perception more than anything, and how each individual views suffering. Because I mean, how about this? Oh, let me ask you, because I know what my answer is. Have you ever suffered?
Yeah.
You have.
Yeah.
Actually suffered in your. So when I asked that question, yes, you had.
Yeah. Have you?
No.
You've never suffered.
See, but we have different views of what suffering is. I would say losing a leg is like suffering. I would say getting beat up by like a gang of guys, that's suffering. That's like traumatic damage, right? I don't think I've ever suffered more than maybe tearing my ACL or emotionally being hurt from a breakup. But I don't see myself having ever suffered.
I don't think suffering is like meeting a requirement for me. Like, I don't think you have to meet this threshold of like how bad things are for it to qualify as suffering. I think people can suffer their own intellect. I think people can actually suffer their own minds. And like Jeremy, for instance, you know, like we've talked to Jeremy about his depression, and I would call that a form of suffering, right? And like, it's not like he lost a leg, or it's just his body isn't functioning the way that he wants it to, and he experiences this level of suffering,
right?
So like, I've gone through levels of depression that were not super severe, but that were pretty bad for what I saw as the bar in my life for suffering, you know. So so like, I don't think suffering is a comparative thing. I think it like, it goes back to what you're saying. It's something that's based on your own perception of it. And like, if your perception of your own suffering is just a comparative thing, then maybe you wouldn't label your suffering as suffering. You know, like you're saying. But
well, I mean, at least for me, in the way I view it, it's got to be something pretty extreme for me to like view it as suffering. Because I would say even being, you know, even being put through like officer candidate school with the Marine Corps, like even that wasn't suffering, and I hated it. Yeah, like it sucked during, but I wouldn't classify it as I was suffering.
What would need to happen for you to be suffering?
I think it's kind of like it goes back to depression, and we talked about this before. Is sadness is sadness.
Yeah.
Depression is chronic. So I think for me, suffering would have to be chronic, or something that was just so impactful to the point where it's traumatic. Where I literally see a physical and mental shift in myself after the fact or the event or whatever it is, the situation. So I think that's what I would classify as suffering. So it all depends on the way I view it, right? So like me tearing my ACL wasn't suffering to me. That was just me playing a sport and being in pain, right? That was a lot of pain, but it wasn't really suffering.
Okay.
I think not being able to run, I wouldn't necessarily classify as suffering. It was chronic, I guess, in a sense, because it was 6 months of having to not being able to run or to do a lot of the things that I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'd necessarily call that suffering, at least in my own mind.
Yeah. So yeah, the reason why I don't think it's something that can be a comparative thing, or like something that you have to meet a certain threshold, is because it is an experience. Like it's an experience, and all experience is generated from within you, right? Like, you don't experience from outside.
Right.
You experience from within your body and your mind, and your being. And I tend to think of suffering as just simply the step above pain. You know, as the step of like, it's no longer just a bodily pain. It has moved on to you know, this mental and this being of like, the pain of the mental and the being is how I look at suffering.
Okay.
And I see that as very broad, whereas I think you see it as more narrow, where like it has to meet something that's like really high in the form of like mental pain, and you know, your inner pain, for it to be meeting that level of suffering.
Right. Which is essentially what you're saying. It's just that there's more of a, I guess you could say, expectation of what suffering really is. No,
How so?
because it's, I think, yeah, I don't know how to explain it. It might be kind of hard because since I kind of don't feel like I've ever suffered, I don't really know what.
Yeah, so here's maybe something that might help. I think there are varying degrees of suffering.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's really important. I can suffer minor, like a minor thing. You know, I can suffer like someone cutting me off in traffic, and I suffer my own rage, right?
Okay.
I suffer being in a state of hatred,
Mm.
and that is me suffering. I would call that as suffering because
Mm.
I am suffering my own like self
Yeah.
rather than it being like just this like painful thing, this like, you know,
Right.
like whatever. But then you can also suffer all the way up the scale up to like grief, right? Like that's
Right,
it's
yeah,
an
yeah.
extreme form of suffering. If you like lost your entire family, like that would be possibly like the highest form of like emotional suffering, for instance, right? So it's probably
Right.
varying levels of suffering and in varying aspects of who we are, but I think of it as like that step above pain. But yeah, I think that's important because like if you see that it is this really big spectrum, that
Mhm.
it can be really, you know, minute suffering, but it can also be extreme suffering.
Right.
Then at least for me that's what I mean by I think of it as this really broad scoping thing where people can
Yeah.
suffer all over, and people are suffering all over the place, even who are super privileged and who have, you know, everything that you would think is a requirement for a good life.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, yeah. It's more of a broad range rather than just some classification to get suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think I think a big part of suffering is also what we were talking about, which is acceptance.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I think we people tend to suffer less when they get into a good habit of accepting the world around them and what is. So,
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned if your whole family were to die, right, and pass away, you'd be distraught, right? There's a lot of that comes into play. But I would argue that someone who has a strong acceptance of death around them for themselves or for their family members has the potential to not necessarily suffer through something like that.
Yeah.
So it could be pain, but they might not see it as suffering themselves. They might just see it as pain.
And this goes back to what I was talking about, where like, can you imagine not experiencing suffering from, you know, your family dying?
Yeah.
I can't imagine not experiencing suffering.
Yeah.
But like that is contrary to what a lot of people are trying to promote of like suffering, we should try and remove it at all costs.
Right.
And like even Sam Harris made this example where he's like, if you could take a pill after your child dies to remove the grief, would you take that pill? And I feel like almost everyone would consider that a perversion of grief. You know, like
Yeah.
you're not respecting the process, and you're not like giving respect to what that actually meant to you, right? It's like it's a perversion.
Right.
And this is why I struggle with this is because like I see this dilemma where like suffering is a bad thing. You know, like it hurts. It's no one ever wants to feel it, but I feel like it is a necessity in a lot of ways. You know, like just because it's the way that we're like wired, like to see these things as important to make it meaningful, right? Like without suffering, I feel like a lot of things kind of lose a bit of meaning,
Yeah.
like death and grief is they go together, like if death isn't paired with grief, and grief is a form of suffering, I would label it. I mean, maybe it's not. I mean, I haven't thought about this a lot, but I think of it as like a form of suffering.
Mm.
But it's a form of suffering that we kind of cherish.
Yeah.
It's like we we see it as this sacred honoring of like what it meant to us.
Yeah.
And if you're not actually suffering, it's almost a perversion of like the grief, right?
Yeah.
Like, am I wrong with that?
No, I think and one example I thought of while you're talking about that was that Black Mirror episode where the woman loses her husband, and she is filled with grief and suffering to the point where she actually looks up, right? If you can have your husband recreated exactly as he was, like the skin feels the same, it's a clone, right? But she looked up to see if her husband could be cloned. And so she clones him,
Yeah,
gets him dropped off. You remember this episode,
Yeah.
right? Like, and when you said perversion, like it just made me think of this, where she didn't want to try to forget her husband. She just wanted him back so bad to the
Yeah.
point where she couldn't take the suffering.
Yeah.
To where she ordered, a clone, and then it just, like you're saying, like we need that suffering. We need, but I see different levels of it. I felt like if for her to do something like that, it means that she got to a point of suffering where she just couldn't bear it anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think what we're essentially hoping for in life is low levels of suffering, which is weird to say, right? Because you're like, oh wow, so you actually want suffering. But I think the people that are most appreciative,
Yeah.
to the point where like they don't have trauma necessarily, are the ones that have low levels of suffering, that have gone through certain events that it hasn't changed their life forever necessarily, but it's enough to allow them to appreciate and have gratitude for the things that they have around them and for the people that they have around them. So, I mean, I'm not saying we want suffering, but I feel like that's almost like the sweet spot. And we talked about this a little bit earlier with frustration, on how, like, I was happy that I was frustrated this past weekend because it just means that I still have this like, I can only go up from here.
Yeah.
Right. I have something to look forward to because I'm frustrated. I know that soon something's gonna come to help me understand what it is, where it is that I'm at. Right.
Yeah. So here's a thought, and I think this is probably important for me to say, which is like, perhaps I like to label anything as a form of suffering is to oversimplify, the complexities of emotion and experience.
Yeah.
Because like earlier I said, grief is a form of suffering, which looking back at me saying that, I would say that's a very like narrow perspective of what grief is. Like grief can look a million different ways based on the person, based on the relationship, right?
Right.
And to say it's just a form of suffering, I feel like that is kind of missing the point, which kind of makes more sense to what I was saying aside from that, which was it's a perversion to think of like not having suffering and grief. I think what I was trying to say there is like grief is really important, but like it's important for a lot more reasons than just the suffering. Like it is the embodiment of love. It's the embodiment of like the unity and the shared memories and the role that you had in each other's lives and what you did for each other and all the memories. And grief is so much more than just a form of suffering. And I think that's an important thing that I had to say. But I think that also brings a little bit of light to suffering, because like I think it might be wrong for me to be labeling anything as just a form of suffering when it really is a lot more complex than that. Like I think this makes it, in a way, a little bit more clear why, you know, suffering isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, where like we talked about these graphs, these stages that you go through, and like how there's ups and downs in life. You know, I think it's it's kind of like, because it is this really wide ranging thing where like you can experience suffering in emotion, and in in just mental anxiety. You can experience suffering of like grief, of there there's probably a lot of different forms of what suffering can look like. um but this is all to say, like, I think it's a little more complex, and because it's more complex, that that's why it makes sense, why it feels like almost like needed, like it is this like really important part of what life is. And yeah, like I,
Do you
yeah, go
mean to
ahead.
say like it's since like um this unity is attached to grief, right? Are you trying to say like that's why suffering is necessary, because everything almost seems to be attached to one another? So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
almost like there is no, you can't have all these emotions, anger, happiness, all this without having suffering as part of the mix,
yeah.
right?
I think that's a good
And
way to put
grief
it.
and all these other like negative, quote unquote, negative
Yeah, yeah,
emotion, right?
yeah. I think that's a good way to put it, because like if you start to see it, like, I mean, I haven't thought about this too much, so we're just kind of riffing here, but
Yeah.
you know, if it is really this thing that's more fundamental to just being human, and having all these character traits and these things that we value so much about the nuance of emotion and capability of a human being.
Mm-hmm.
If suffering is kind of inherent to a lot of that, then maybe it isn't something that we should see as a bad thing. Maybe it is this kind of imbuer of meaning,
Right.
like with like going back to grief, like that is what I was talking about with like suffering is a part of it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not the whole of it.
Right.
And without that part, it does lose a bit of its meaning.
Yeah, I feel like, and the one word that really sticks out to me when I think of suffering is also gratitude.
Yeah.
Because I think by, when enduring suffering, the first thing that I would think of is what you're grateful for when you're going through that, right? You're thinking of, man, I mean, like you said, suffering is broad. So let's just say, for instance, you're without a jacket and you're in negative 30-degree weather.
Holy.
I'm pretty sure there's a lot of gratitude for jackets, for warm weather, right? Like
Yeah,
that just
yeah.
seems to be kind of like how in grief you have uh the love that you have for someone, right? Which is why you miss them so much. You have to have grief with love, love with grief.
Yeah.
Um
That's great,
and
because that, like, what you're saying here is like they can exist at the same time.
and I was gonna bring up the word duality, but
Yeah.
this is so much bigger than just duality.
Yeah.
It's like duality on, but instead of two, it's multiple.
X Games mode duality.
It's polyality. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Polyality. I don't know what to call it. But that's what it seems like.
Yeah,
Is none of these things can exist apart from each other.
right.
They all
Yeah.
have to exist or together as one, essentially.
Yeah. And maybe that's what Buddhism is getting at. I need to read more about Buddhism,
Yeah.
and maybe that's what it's getting at. It's like embrace the suffering.
Right.
It's suffering is only suffering if you're trying to escape it.
Right.
If you're just with it and
Right.
you are accepting of the suffering, and you like appreciate the suffering, like we talked about on a previous episode, misery is wasted on the miserable.
Yeah.
Right? Appreciate the misery,
Yeah.
because it is the full expression of how much you loved someone
Right.
after they're gone, after you break up, whatever.
Yeah.
Appreciate that misery, because that is just such a sweet expression of how much you cared. Right? So yeah, I think we're kind of on the same page with this, that it is this really important aspect of a whole range of what it means to be a human. And
Right.
it's not so much uh, the suffering is a bad thing. Uh, it's like not embracing the suffering is the bad thing. You
Mhm.
know, like when you throw away the misery,
Right.
you know, when you throw it away because you know what was it worth? You know, what was
Mhm.
my time worth for that person if I'm just
Right.
going to be miserable? Throwing that away is apathy. It's numbness. It's nihilism. And I think this is like in a Lumineer song. I think it's like
Mhm.
the opposite of love is indifference, and
Mhm.
that's sort of along the lines of what we're trying to say here, which is like, you know, lacking suffering is almost a form of like indifference in a way.
Right.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of adds to the point of stress recovery adaptation, right? If you take out the sitting with it and just try to get rid of it, then there is no recovery.
yeah,
There is no growth,
yeah, yeah,
right? So the stress is the suffering. The recovery is sitting with it,
yeah,
understanding it for what it is, not trying to rid yourself of it.
yeah,
And then that's where the adaptation, the growth of, okay, like I'm able to sit with this more. Um,
yeah,
you know, so you still feel it, obviously. It's just no longer maybe in a way that you used to see it.
yeah.
It's in this new light.
I think that's probably the overarching thing that we're talking about, which is like a reframing
Mm-hmm.
of suffering and a reframing of like meaning. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like if you can reframe suffering no longer as like this this like horrible thing you have to bear,
Yeah.
but like, you know, it can be a beautiful thing, and it is a vital thing to just being human, to having the experiences that you find so meaningful. um so yeah, it is like a reframing and like a redefinition
Mm-hmm.
of what it means to suffer.
Right. And I think once you kind of learn to reframe it in that way, it also helps a lot more when it comes to explaining it to other people and
Yeah,
understanding other people. Because I feel like a lot of times when we don't know what to do with our emotions, we just want to push it away.
yeah,
So by learning to sit with it, understand it, you don't just help
yeah,
yourself, you help everyone around you as well.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. That's, I feel like that's so much better intuitively than saying like what a lot of mystics and like gurus are saying, which is
mhm.
like, no, you shouldn't be suffering. It's just like,
Right.
it's like embrace it,
Yeah.
and, you know, like stick with it
Mhm.
and let it do its thing, you know. And like, funnily enough, I feel like uh Inside Out, the Disney movie, kind
Yeah.
of, it is the perfect example of what that is, you know. Like when you allow yourself to fully experience sadness, you know, when you fully allow yourself the vulnerability to just fucking feel, and to stop trying to suppress your sadness and just let it happen. That's when, you know, that's when acceptance comes. That's when people come to help you. That's when, you know, that's when you're more open to talking about things. And eventually that's when you start to slowly come to terms with the sadness and it turns into something else.
Right.
And that's the only way to work through it, is to be with it, you know. And I feel like that's the whole thing that mushrooms just tells you when you're going through a mushroom trip. If
Yeah.
you're ever on a bad trip, that is what it is. It's like you can't run from these things. You have to be with them
Right.
and go through the journey of whatever journey you're on. If it's suffering, if it, you know, whatever form of suffering it is, it could be emotional,
Right.
grief. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of different forms.
The more you try to detach from it, the harder things are gonna be.
Yes.
I feel like the more that you understand that, just like emotions, um, our being, our essence, it it's not something separate. It's all it's all one.
Yeah.
And the sooner we can understand that, I think the less suffering there will be, right? So
we did it.
we did it. We figured it out.
Oh my god, that's really good.
Well, so we kind of went on a rant about
Yeah.
suffering. Let's try to tie this back into meaning and purpose. I mean, that was a great conversation. Like I'm glad we went on that tangent because I think there's a lot that we can take out of that. But as far as like meaning and purpose, and expectation, right? So that's kind of why we went that way, was expectation and acceptance, right?
Yeah.
I'm so stuck on suffering.
I know, right? But no, it is super important because, like, there are a lot of things in our life that bring us meaning, but we also kind of suffer through. Like here's a probably one of the most common examples that I've seen, which is like someone suffering through a job to provide for the family, right?
Yeah.
Like how much more meaningful it is for that person to be a provider, to give other people what they wouldn't otherwise have,
right,
if they didn't embrace the suffering. And in that way, that is a reframing of suffering. Like this is what so many people in the US are doing, is they're finding a way to reframe their own suffering, because it is a pain in the ass to do a lot of these jobs, right, to work overtime, and it's really hard. And I can't speak to that personally, but I've seen it firsthand from other people.
I mean, I would say a good example is the 2 podcasts that we've just had. Your dad came from a big family of many siblings, where only your dad or your grandpa, his dad, was in the army, and then they didn't pay that much in the army, so the check that he would send home to your mom was very little, and a lot of times it was just a piece of bologna, cheese, and then bread, and that was all he would eat.
Yeah.
In a day. Same thing with my dad, right? With his story about how when he came to the U.S. As a refugee, the bus that he was on got shot at, and there were like 15 people that died on that bus, but him and his family were unharmed, right? When you go through that kind of suffering, I think that's why, I don't know, at least with your dad and my dad, like I see something in them that just makes them enjoy life a whole lot more. And I think suffering is a big part of that.
A big part of gratitude.
Yeah. And I see them now. My dad, I remember we went to Brazil, because back when he was a kid, like he didn't even have shoes. He had like sandals, and that's all he would wear ever. And or he would just walk barefoot around the streets where he grew up. And we went to Brazil, and his dream was always to go stand in the field, the Maracanã, right, where the first World Cup was played. And we ended up doing that. And I saw like tears come like streaming down his face, and it's like all that suffering, all these things that he thought were, all these expectations that he had that he never thought he would accomplish, but he had big dreams of, he was able to do. And that was through suffering, through working jobs and hours that he didn't want to work, through making the trip over here and almost getting shot at and killed. Right. Same thing with your dad and his industry, and he wanted to help people, and he suffered a lot with his youth and growing up. All of that accounts for what makes us who we are today, and what makes people so special. So I think it's just about how we view it, and the acceptance of this is what it is.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a way to tie this in with what we've talked about so much, with like Alan Watts, which is Alan Watts is like a 1960s philosopher. He calls himself a word technologist. Pretty arrogant statement, but he has this really beautiful video on YouTube. If you wanted to look it up, I think it's called like "What is the point?" Or like "What is your point of your life?" There's probably a lot of different clips on YouTube with this, but he basically talks about like you start off in first grade, and like the whole thing with starting off or like you start off kindergarten, and the whole thing with kindergarten is you're getting ready to go to first grade, and the whole thing with first grade is you're preparing for second grade, and you're preparing for third, and for high school, and then high school you're preparing for college, and college you're prepared for the world with a capital W, and you know, you go through the ranks of your job at work, you know, from the very beginning all the way up to being a manager, and then you get to a point where you're in your mid 40s, and you've accomplished everything you've set out to accomplish, and you're working the job you thought you would as a child, and you say, "Oh, I finally made it," and you don't feel very different from how you've always felt, right?
Yeah.
And it's the thing that he says is, you know, you've treated life like a journey, like a pilgrimage, where the point of it was to get to some end, and the only point of your moment to moment existence was to get to some goal, to get to some end. You know, he's like, you've been treating life like a journey when it's a musical thing. It's a dance. You know, you were supposed to dance while the music was being played. And he's like, you know, the best, if purpose and meaning were goal oriented, then all of the best things would happen quick. You know, he's like, all of the best songs would just be grand finales, like it's just one cracking chord and it's over, and people applaud. Wow, what a meaningful song that was. You know, but we all intuitively know that the music is only enjoyed in a moment to moment basis. You know, you can't just appreciate the song when it ends. You know, like the song is only able to be enjoyed to its full extent if you're with it the whole way through, right? And I think that is sort of what we're getting at here with this suffering. You know, it's not about trying to get out of it. It's not about trying to get through the suffering towards the next thing. It's more about being with it the whole way through, you know, embracing it the whole way through. And if you're able to be with that the whole way through, whatever thing you get to on the other side is so much more beautiful, and you have so much more gratitude for it if you were with the suffering, if you weren't always trying to escape it when you were in it. Because if you were always trying to escape it, by the time you get to this nugget, this beautiful moment in your life where you've got this culmination of everything happening perfectly, you can't fully appreciate it because it was your expectation that it should have been that way the whole way along. Right. And yeah, I think that's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. You know, it's be with the process. You know, don't run from where you are, accept where you are and work from there, and don't try and escape your suffering. You know?
Yeah. No, I mean, and I want to bring up you and Chloe, because that was in essence like what ended up happening is you were just kind of like, I have this expectation of how I want everything to be. And, you know, and I've seen the shift in you and Chloe since I see you guys a lot. That mentality shift of like, accept where you're at, accept the circumstances, you know, where everything's at, and then move forward from there and like work on that, right? Instead of just seeing this as like this thing and how it is and it's never going to change. Like, that's not true at all, right? And so there's a lot more beauty in that than there is in just finding quote unquote the perfect one and just everything is 100% great. I couldn't imagine. I think, you know, at least for me, like there's a sense of boredom that comes with everything just being fantastic all the time. Like there's it's life loses its meaning when everything is just given to you, or you know, it's just too easy. You know, we always joke around, give me a challenge, right? Like you want the challenge though. You want, you know, as you get older, you want less challenges. You want to select your challenges, right? You don't just want challenges to like be presented at you all the time. But, you know, you want selective challenges. And I think, you know, especially when it comes to relationships, that's a good thing when, you know, and I think the stress recovery adaptation is huge also for relationships. Because, you know, there's always going to be that stress. At least if you're in like a pretty decent relationship, right? There's, I'm just saying, it's not always going to be rainbows and sunshine. So it's like, you know, and that recovery process has to be in a way where both of you guys understand how to move forward with that, right? Acceptance and moving forward with that. So
Dang, there's so many good ways we can go from here. I think we're getting like near the end,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I do want to go a couple different ways and then go stop after that.
Okay.
But what you said kind of opened the floodgates to something I've thought a ton about
Mm-hmm.
and I've written about a lot, which is like everything going your way
Ooh.
and it being boring and it not being meaningful. And this has been my life where
Same.
everything has gone my way
Yeah.
to the point that like because my way was just complacency and my way was like not challenging myself.
Mm.
It was a stagnant life and it was one without much meaning. And since embracing sort of the suffering, since embracing the suffering that comes with challenging yourself, with being open to more relationships and being open to taking on other people's hardships and that kind of thing,
Right.
my life has been exponentially more meaningful since doing that.
Mm.
And this idea of like everything going your way, I talk about specifically when it comes to heaven.
Mm.
And I think it's something that most people don't usually think about, which is like, what is your ideal situation? And when I say that, I'm really asking what could heaven actually be like for it to be something that you want for eternity?
Oh,
And
yeah.
not just like what you think the book says or like, what the culture around you says heaven is. What could an ideal actually be?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you start going through everything that thought experiment entails, you kind of arrive at what we've arrived at today, which is like there are so many things about suffering, about conflict, about like hardships, about going through something and it failing a million times until you finally succeed. There's something about these things that we need for it to be heaven, for
Right.
it to be meaningful.
Right.
Like meaning does not exist independent from conflict, independent from suffering, independent from this hardship growth, growth.
Yeah.
Like that is what gives life so much meaning. And yeah, I think that is like not talked about that often. Like I think people are usually spending their time working towards an ideal rather than seeing that, one, what could ideal even look like?
Right.
And then two, once you've kind of looked at that, you see that we can bring heaven on earth right now where we are. Like if you see that conflict is necessary, that grief and temporality to relationships is necessary for the relationship to be meaningful. Like if you existed forever, you can have a relationship with every single person who's ever lived and do every single activity with every single person forever and ever and ever, infinite times. Right? It just completely erases any meaning in life.
Right.
And I think when people start thinking about that, and particularly heaven, I think it's a great thing to think about. You start to see, okay, my life is so much more meaningful than a life full of everything going my way.
Yeah.
Right? Like this isn't so bad. This is actually what this is what we've been looking for. Yeah. Right? And one last thing, and then I'll hand it over to you. Alan Watts gives another great analogy to this, which is imagine every night you were able to dream 75 years worth of subjective experience. Every night when you go to bed, you're able to dream 75 years worth of any dream you want to dream. And, the first couple nights of 75 years each, you would probably satisfy all your wildest dreams. You'd probably do everything you ever wanted to do, and it would be incredible. You would wake up after the first week of 75 years each, and you go, wow, that was fucking incredible. Yeah. But after a certain amount of time, you're gonna be like, you know what? I want a surprise. I don't want everything going my way anymore. It's getting a little boring.
Right.
I want to go into a dream where I don't know what's gonna happen next. Right. And then you go through that, and you come out of that thinking, wow, that was something else. I almost didn't make it out of that one. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, holy shit, that was an
Oh, man.
experience right there. I think I didn't have control of that one.
Right.
And this is where he arrives at, and he says, eventually you'll arrive at the situation where you are now. You will arrive at the life that you are currently living, right? If that is within the infinite multiplicity of dreams that you could dream.
Yeah.
When you go to bed, when you finally surrender, when you finally say, you know what, I want to abandon all control.
Right.
I want to go into a dream and forget I'm dreaming.
Yeah.
And experience what it's like to just live spontaneously in that moment.
Yeah.
And he's like, this is it. You are at it right now, where you have already, if you go through this thought experiment, you've gone through what heaven could be like. You've experienced 75 years, and it gets boring. You finally arrive at the life you're currently living. So fucking appreciate where you are.
Right.
Like, this is magic. This is incredible what we have right here, to live a life with so much surprise and so much conflict and hardship, and get so much meaning out of all of that. And yeah, there are tons of forms of unnecessary suffering in the world, and I'm not trying to say it's like the whole world is heaven and everything is perfect the way it is. It's just in seeing that this life is so much more than just a test for the afterlife, but like also so much more meaningful than I think people give it credit for. Like, and that thought experiment is one reason why I think that it really does put it into perspective. Like, control is not what any sensible person wants. Controlling everything, it does result in, like, you've if the future is known with certainty, it's already happened, right? So surprise is necessary to life, and it's necessary for there to be meaning, and it's necessary for any story to be good, any movie to be good, any book. They all have conflict. They all have this hero who's gone through fucking shit and worked goddamn hard to save whatever the fuck they saved. And without that first half, it doesn't mean anything.
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry for that rant.
No, you're good. I mean, that pretty much, I think, wrapped it all up. I was, I guess I'll just add a little bit of advertising because I'm really excited for this. But Batman came out this weekend.
Ooh.
And Dark Knight, Batman, all kind of fits into that, suffering and what it can do to, it's basically, it's a metaphor for a lot of that. So, but it's something on the top of my head right now that I thought about that I've been really excited to watch next week. So, a little bit of advertisement on Batman. Apparently, I've heard from reviews it's really, really good.
I've heard from everyone it's really good. I've heard people say it's better than The Dark Knight, which
man.
I'm like,
with
what?
the joke, I know with Heath Ledger, I know, man. That was a good freaking movie, man. So, I'm super excited about that. But I guess today, we start off with meaning, purpose, expectation. We tied in some suffering, which we found out is crucial, into acceptance and gratitude, and helping us kind of measure meaning, or it brings a lot of meaning, and helping us measure expectation. So I felt like today we kind of winged it, and honestly, I felt like it was better when we winged it than when it's super structured. Like it felt more like conversation.
Check out the structure, man.
Yeah, man. So next week we'll try to have a guest on. This weekend was a little bit busy for me with tournaments for my kids, but things are going to slow down a little bit, and then Sammy's getting married soon, so we've just kind of been all over the place with our responsibilities. But we'll try to get a special guest next week, hoping to get one of our buddies, so that we can shoot it on a Saturday and then get it to you guys on YouTube on Monday. So thanks for listening. I had a lot of fun today.
Dude, that was great. I feel like I learned something today. Talking about it, I just write about it, man. You You
gotta
gotta
talk about it.
speak these things into existence.
Oh, by the way, just side note here. I started doing stream of consciousness every morning when I wake up. Sammy's dad talked about it in our video from last week, which we're gonna post up today for you guys on YouTube. And it's been great. I'm really good at talking to myself, but when I put pen to paper, or when I put words out through text on my laptop on the notes, it's another form of letting those thoughts kind of just go, right? So, like you were saying, I think it's good to have a balance of everything. Someone to talk to it about, a journal for yourself. And I've never liked journals, but typing it on my computer just works for me. So, whatever it is, just try to find those ways to let your thoughts kind of go out, and to, just learn to accept everything, and, sit with your thoughts. So,
That's
yeah.
good.
All right. Well, we'll catch you guys next week. This is the Dick and Russ podcast, and we're out.
Subscribe. See you next time.